The federal government says it will soon be expanding and renewing Canada's submarine fleet. Defence Minister Blair says he's confident the new purchases will help Canada meet its NATO spending targets. Canada is currently on track to spend 1.76% of its GDP on defence by the end of the decade. But under its agreement with NATO, Canada pledged to commit to 2% of its GDP on defence. Blair is the Minister of National Defence. Welcome back to the show, Minister.
Thank you very much, JP. Thanks for having me.
So you released a new defence policy just last month, but yesterday you acknowledged Canada has more work to do to boost spending on the armed forces. What can Canadians expect? Will you spend more before we can finally hit that 2% of GDP spending target?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge Canadians can expect that we'll deliver on our new policy update. It already includes some substantial new investments in our defense and in, I think provides an appropriate level of focus in continental defense and in our Arctic. But I also acknowledge to Canadians and to our allies that, Canada is making a very significant advancement in investment in our defense capability, but we still have more work to do. And I highlighted for our allies some of those additional things that we know we need to do, but quite frankly, I and my department and the Canadian Armed Forces, we've got some work to do in order to make that case to Canadians to secure the funding. But the work is well underway and we know what needs to be done and we're engaged in doing it.
One of the things you said that we might have to work on is purchasing some new submarines, but the defense strategy that you just released last month really was not so specific about this. They said that Canada will explore purchasing some subs. You seemed a little more definitive yesterday about this. Are you saying now that's a sure thing? Can Canadians expect the government to procure new submarines sometime soon?
JP, I can share with Canadians and you that Canada needs new submarines. We have a rather aging class of Victoria-class submarines we bought secondhand in the 90s. They really are no longer fit for purpose, and we know that we are going to require underwater surveillance capabilities. The Royal Canadian Navy is already hard at work in defining what their requirements will be, and we will eventually go into the marketplace to see what's available to meet those requirements. But I want to be very clear, and we were in the defense policy document. When we said we were exploring this, it was an acknowledgement. It's something we need to do, an investment Canada will need to make. But I also wanted to be very clear. We've identified our immediate priorities and spending requirements, and we now have a fully funded proposal with the budget that was introduced earlier last month. We're going to be able to fund the things that we said we are absolutely going to do, but we also acknowledge there's more to do. And so I wanted to alert our allies, but also share with Canadians about the work that is ahead of us. But once that work is done, we absolutely are going to require new submarines to fulfill our mission of keeping our coast safe in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, and most importantly in the Arctic. We also know that there are other really significant investments we're going to have to make in things like integrated air missile defense, in replacing our tanks. Those are all future initiatives. We're doing the work now to make sure that we can make informed decisions. Every dollar we spend has to be well spent. It has to have a really significant and important return on the investment that Canadian taxpayers will make in their national defense. And so my obligation is to make sure we do that work. And we do it in concert and in partnership with our allies and with industry. And so that work is now proceeding, but when that work is completed, at least reaches a stage where I can come back to Canadians and to the government and say, we're now ready to proceed. I'll be asking for the resources necessary to complete that, but we're not right at that stage yet.
I think I heard you say yesterday as well that if we do procure these submarines, they will get Canada closer to that 2% of GDP spending target. Right now, with the defense strategy that was released, we're at about 1.76. That's what you're projecting it will be in 2029, 2030. But do you understand why people might be a bit skeptical about the procurement process? I mean, we started the procurement process for the C-18s decades ago. We still don't have a plane. So if you're saying that we'll reach the 2% target if we buy these subs, that suggests it will be way down the line, that we're really not even close to hitting that 2% target anytime soon.
Well, one of the reasons I'm starting the work now, determining what the Navy's requirements will be and seeing what's available in the marketplace, is we're trying to accelerate those processes because, in my opinion, there is an urgent need for that capability for the Royal Canadian Navy, for the defense of Canada, but also to fulfill our obligations in the North Atlantic and the Pacific and in our Arctic. And so we're beginning that work now. And yes, I understand that there have been previously very difficult and challenging procurement processes that we've undertaken. But I would share with you, JP, we're starting to make some very real and frankly rapid process in acquiring the things that our armed forces need. Just in the past 2 years, we've secured contracts for delivery of 140 new aircraft. We're working very closely with Canada's national shipbuilding industry in order to procure 15 new surface combatant ships. We're also building supply ships and Arctic offshore patrol vessels. So we've begun to actually deliver on those aspirations. And I think it was really important. But clearly the world has changed. The threat environment has changed significantly. A lot of our existing equipment is frankly aging out of service. And we know what needs to be done. We're doing the work now to get ready. Again, I'm always cautious about investing hard-earned Canadian taxpayer dollars. I think the job is to go get the best value possible for them. And that really requires that we do the work. We do the analysis, we talk to our allies, we talk to industry, we determine exactly what we require and then work diligently towards delivering that. I think the best response to that skepticism and you often hear is our hard work. And I hope I've been able to convey to our allies our absolute commitment to get the job done.
Yeah, speaking of our allies, it's not just people like me that badger you about the 2% spending target. We heard from Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron just a few days ago. He was calling out NATO allies. He says Western countries need to step up, spend more on their militaries. He says Britain and the U.S. can't shoulder the burden alone. As you say, we're in a different threat environment. Does it frustrate you that some of our allies think that we're freeloading?
Well, let me be really clear, JP. I think there has been historically, and back in 2014, for example, Canada was spending less than 1% of its GDP on defense. That was certainly unsustainable and inadequate. But since 2017 in particular, our government has really begun to invest significantly. A lot of those purchases and procurements were actually a little loaded into the future, but we're now reaching that point. In fact, defense spending in Canada, JP, is going to increase next year over this year by 27%. That's historically unprecedented. And quite frankly, among our allies, I think it demonstrates one of the strongest upward trajectories of defense spending. But we've also tried to be very clear with our allies. We know we have more to do. And so Canada is significantly investing its procurement. But if I may, it's not just acquiring the money and spending the money, but it's spending the money well. It's making sure that we invest Canadian tax dollars in an appropriate way. We achieve the best possible outcome for those investments, that we actually acquire exactly what we need. I'm going to need to spend those dollars, but I don't want to spend one extra dollar to make it happen. So I think that's our responsibility too. I just want to assure Canadians, like we're doing the work now. We're doing the work that is necessary. That's why we're meeting with our allies. It's why we're meeting with industry. There's a great deal of work going on within CAF and the Ministry of National Defence to determine exactly what our requirements will be, the best place to invest the hard-earned Canadian tax dollars in delivering upon those capabilities. We know there are a number of challenges for the Canadian Armed Forces and for our national defense, but through the National Defense Policy, we've actually provided real focus on what the mission is. And our first priority is the defense of our country, the defense of the continent, particularly a focus in the Arctic. That helps us understand exactly what we're going to need and what we need to do in order to fulfill that responsibility. I'm also very mindful of our responsibilities to NATO. Canada is deploying up to a brigade strength in 2026 in Latvia. We also have additional responsibilities in the Indo-Pacific. To meet that moment and to respond to those responsibilities, we know we've got a ton of work to do, but we're doing that work, we're making the investments. And as I'm able to spend those Canadian taxpayers' dollars well, I'll come back with that business case. I'll come back and make the explanation to Canadians on what needs to be done next. But we're quite prepared to proceed. And I'm able to assure Canadians and our allies, Canada's on the right track and strengthening our position at home and abroad in providing an appropriate level of investment in our Canadian Armed Forces and in our national defense. I
take your point that spending has gone up rather significantly under this government, but as I mentioned earlier, we're still not at that 2%, right? We're projected to be at 1.76 by the end of the decade. And then there was a Canadian press story earlier this month that quoted one of your recent speeches, and it said, quoting you, that it's really hard to convince Canadians, and maybe suggesting even your cabinet colleagues, that hitting that 2% target is a worthy goal, that you're finding it difficult to maybe convince people that there should be a lot more spending on these issues, on our armed forces. Are you finding it hard to convince your cabinet colleagues to spend more so we can reach that NATO target?
JP, respectfully, I think that Canada Press article a little bit misrepresented what I was trying to explain to the audience I was speaking to on that day. And what I was explaining is that I couldn't simply just go to Canadians as the new Minister of National Defence and say, we have to spend this much money to meet the mathematical formula of our NATO commitment. I don't get me wrong. I absolutely am committed to meeting that 2%. But that isn't much of a case to put before Canadians. I think we not only had to say how much we needed to spend and what we needed to spend on, but I think I needed to provide an explanation to Canadians about why these investments were necessary. Because there are a lot of competing interests for affordability issues in housing, healthcare, childcare, dental care, pharmacare. There are so many things that Canadians need from their government, and those are very important things. But I also had to make an explanation to Canadians as to why it was our responsibility and why it was necessary in a changing environment with climate change making the Arctic more accessible, with some of the activities of our adversaries now encroaching and being far more aggressive in our Arctic, and finally the new technologies of warfare. We have to meet that moment and step up and be prepared to defend Canada. And we have to do it in concert with our allies, the United States through NORAD, all of the European countries and the United States through NATO, and with our new responsibilities. I had to make that case to Canadians. That was the part that was, frankly, it wasn't hard because I think we've got a compelling story to tell, but it was my responsibility to explain to Canadians not just what we needed to do and how much we needed to spend. The real challenge was to make sure that we were very clear with Canadians why this was a necessary investment, and to provide them with some assurances that we would be careful spending their money and that we would try to produce the best public value for the investment of their hard-earned dollars.
Okay, we'll leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you, Bill Blair, the Minister of National Defence. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks, JP.